Welcome. I'm Peter Vogel, partner at Gardier, and I wanted to welcome everybody to our program today about cyber breaches and cybersecurity and what you might do to help your business. Let me start by making this comment. If you didn't already notice it, the Wi-Fi access, you can't hear. Look at the screen then, Gary. It's a clue. Okay, so let me allow each one of our guests that are co-sponsoring the program with us today to introduce themselves. First, I'm going to ask Rebecca Perry, who's with Jordan Lawrence, to briefly tell y'all what she does and what Jordan Lawrence does to get an idea about how the comments today are going to be more meaningful and helpful and give you some insight. So, Rebecca.
Thank you, Peter.
And I think the mics need to be closer to what I'm advised.
All right. Can you guys hear me? I think we're turned on. Hello?
I don't know. Doesn't look like it, but it does.
There we go. Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Perry with Jordan Lawrence. Jordan Lawrence has been around for about 26 years, and our whole focus is to help companies get their arms around their records and information practices. I've been there 20 years, so I've seen the struggles that companies have in understanding what records and information they have, where it is, how long they're keeping it. Usually companies hold on to information for a very long time. And, in the privacy space, it's hypersensitive to the types of sensitive information that records contain. So we very quickly can help companies get their arms around what they have, where it is, how long they're keeping it, and understand the sensitive nature of their records. So what I bring to the table today is kind of an understanding of what that process looks like and what companies need to do to get a better handle on their practices.
Sitting next to Rebecca is Garen Pace with AIG. Garen?
Good afternoon. My name is Garen Pace. I'm the head of underwriting excellence for AIG's Cyber Liability Group. I think you all know AIG, but the financial lines group provides what we colloquially call cyber insurance. It's really information security and privacy insurance that is designed to respond to a lot of the both the first-party costs and the potential liability arising out of losing confidential information. So appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. I've been at AIG 10 years. In my current role, I advise our underwriters on what questions to ask, how to differentiate and assess risk with regards to information security and privacy. I started at AIG as an underwriter of this line in its infancy in the early 2000s. I'm so happy to opportunity. Thanks.
And sitting next to Garen is Kevin O'Malley with Informatica. So, Kevin, would you introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Kevin O'Malley, Director of Product Marketing for Informatica. People kind of know us as a data integration company, if you've heard of us at all. But basically, our tagline is keeping data clean, safe, and connected. In my particular business unit, we focus on the data management side. So, retention of data, data security, and an area called test data management that I'll kind of talk about a little bit. But basically, how you can manage data better for it to be more secure, how you manage data for the long term.
Okay, thank you. And very briefly, before I studied law, I had an opportunity to be a computer programmer and have a master's in computer science. So my law practice is limited to representing information technology and internet clients in litigation and contract negotiating. And as a result, Rebecca and I have gotten to know one another through e-discovery programs over the years. So let me start with this slide. Okay. One of the reasons that I thought this would be an important slide to note, as I know most of y'all probably saw that these Chinese military officers were indicted. But the interesting part about what the indictment was for, it was because they stole data from U.S. companies that were trying to do business in China, they stole their trade secrets so that the Chinese companies would have an advantage over them. So this is the kind of thing that I think we're now being confronted with. It's not just hackers that are out there. We have government-run operations where they're stealing data, and I think that that makes this a very important issue.
Sure. I just wanted to highlight kind of three types of breaches that AIG has seen, and some of these we experienced, and some of these we've seen in the public domain. I actually want to start with the second one because that's the one I think that everyone thinks about when they think about hacking. This was an electronics company who lost a large number of both payment information and personally identifiable information, such as usernames and passwords. But more than hacking, I think it's important to note that it's also possible to lose sensitive information both in a physical paper format and also in the what we call mobile, which includes laptops, thumb drives, or even a backup tape. So I just wanted to hit on the values here, and they run the gamut. Anywhere from $2 million or even $800,000 up to hundreds of millions. So I'm happy to, all three of these are types of loss that AIG and other carriers common cyber insurance respond to. And I just wanted to make sure that as we talk about information security and privacy and the comments of the panel, that we don't focus solely on hacking, but we also focus on accidental disclosure, which was one of those two of those breaches, and also theft, and be it theft for monetary gain, competitive reasons, as intellectual property, as Peter said, or even what they call now hacktivism, basically ideological reasons.
And Garen, we were talking earlier, one of the things that you said was you have conversations with companies, their IT folks specifically, and you ask them, where is your sensitive information? Where does that exist? And they can struggle at times answering those questions. And I think folks here probably are wondering the same things. What do we have and where is it? And how do you figure that out?
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. So that's one of the ways that AIG assesses risk in this space, is that we often talk to our clients about what kind of sensitive information they have. And that can run the gamut from just names and addresses of their customers all the way to payment information in terms of payment card information, credit and debit cards, but also bank account information, corporate confidential information, trade secrets, partnerships with other affiliates. So, oftentimes we're asking folks, what kind of information do you have? Where is it? How much of it have you entrusted to third parties? Particularly as we talk about cloud providers and how that's changing, how we store and use data and access things remotely. It's very tough for companies to answer that question sometimes and tell us where all the data is. So I think that's something that you obviously are focusing on. Maybe you can talk about how you can help companies with that.
And so to look at what laws may be violated by this, I think is important as well. In Texas, under our penal statute since 1985, it's been a crime to penetrate a computer that has a security system. And that's been updated to deal with internet laws as well. And then also federal laws, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and also the Federal Wiretap Act are things that are available to help. But if they cross international boundaries, it gets much more difficult to try and figure out what laws may apply if the material or the goods are being stolen in China, which has a totalitarian government. It's going to become different trying to figure out whether it was a crime in the U.S. or not. And so that makes it difficult. I think the FBI decided it was, and that's why they indicted those Chinese officers.
Which is really, I don't... While it's a bold move to do, a necessary step, it doesn't really mean a whole lot. There's a lot of actors in the organized crime community in Russia. You could talk about corporate espionage out of China. These are all things that there's no legal remedy for them. You have to protect yourself. I don't think a lot of people focus on attribution, and one of the big questions that folks ask is why me? Who did this? Why did they do this? And what can I do about it? And oftentimes, it's a hard question to ask after the fact. It's really about protecting your data. And I think that, you know, Rebecca was jumping in with some of the ways we can find out where your data is and how to protect it. I was interested in hearing about that.
Well, here's the data is, I think it's right.
Yes, can you go back one? If you like, and, just want to touch on this because I've been reading a lot of articles around cyber insurance and, you know, a lot of the questions that you're going to be faced with answering if you are considering cyber insurance or you're looking at your privacy practices and trying to understand your risks. And some of the toughest questions is figuring out, you know, where is it? So one of the things that we help companies do is look inside their business practices. What do employees have? What are they doing with that information? How long are they keeping it? How are they sharing that? What are they taking out of applications and saving to a laptop or saving to a thumb drive? Understanding the legal requirements around that information and the business value of that information. One of the very interesting in the Wall Street Journal, this was last week, this is the Chief Information Security Officer of Blackstone Group. And he said, this is from the C-suite, the number one most significant risk to every organization is your well-intentioned, non-malicious insider. And those are the folks that are handling and dealing with records and information and sensitive information about the company, about customers, employees on a regular basis. And so you can't really skip this step of looking inside the business practices and really understanding what your employees are doing and the value of information and where they're saving it. So that's what we kind of refer to as records DNA. And so the question is, well, how do you get that? How do you understand that information? And if you want to move on kind of to the next slide, it really starts with engaging with the business people that rely on this information, understanding their business needs, understanding the sensitive nature of the records that they work with, if it contains intellectual property that the organization wants to protect. PHI, sensitive information as the EU defines it. Companies can't rely solely on technology to go out and search shared drives and systems to look for things like social security numbers or credit card numbers because, you know, those types of technologies fail when you're thinking about things like intellectual property or the definition of how the EU defines it, which is very specific. And then you have to understand not only the business needs and the sensitive nature of records, but also the different requirements. And this includes retention of information. It includes different state privacy laws that apply. If you're an international organization, then those come into play. And other things like Gramm-Leach-Bliley, Food Safety Modernization Act, all have sort of an impact on how companies should be managing, retaining, and protecting their records and information.
You want to address this one for us?
Yeah, so this actually is a follow-up. This is a Ponemon research from this year. And if you look at the top line, it kind of corroborates what we were talking about. When a CIO is explaining or wants to sign his name to, I know where all the sensitive data is, usually that's where they get very skittish. And a couple, and you kind of notice here that that's actually higher on the list of like what keeps them up at night than some of the other ones, like third-party outsourcing, including cloud, right? So just to kind of, in a non-technical way, just to kind of explain some of the things that happen to the system and why they have this uneasiness is, so if they're doing their own in-house development, if they're buying packaged applications from vendors like Oracle or SAP, one of the reasons why they're saying this is because they don't really own the data model. They don't know where these systems are actually stuffing the data. And it's actually very complicated. We know these systems are very, very complex. So, and the vendors themselves have not been, no one's put kind of the screws to them to say, you have to document everything, you have to document all your processes. And I want to know where all the data's going. And so we actually go out to clients and actually kind of challenge them sometimes just on a single system. And we'll say, in this particular system, let's say it's SAP system. We think you only know where 10 to 20% of your sensitive information is. And they usually kind of laugh. They go, oh, we know where. You talk to a developer, a database administrator, oh, we know where it all is. We know where it all is. And then you talk to the people that own the applications, and they start to get a little bit, well, what about this thing that we built? What about this other area that we built over here? And didn't you build a custom table and a custom extension to the product? And then you start to see the questions. And so we run our discovery. The next slide kind of shows this discovery process that we run. So this is actually not from the user side, like Jordan Lawrence, Rebecca was talking about. This is now coming from inside the system and saying, okay, so now you know what kind of data you have. Let's go look to see where it is. And this is where you find the different locations of the data. And it's usually very, very eye-opening to folks. And they go, okay, now I can understand that there's some areas of the system maybe I'm not locking down. So I have very controlled access to different parts of the system, but maybe some of these extensions I didn't really think about too much, and they're exposed. Sometimes it's actually just data that's being transferred from one system to another, and they left a hole there because the data just kind of stays with this temporary data, and it's just a process where maybe that needs to be flushed out, cleaned out every time it's run. And
does that look across
Single
at
system.
Shared drives? Can you focus that type of a technology to go out and look for that?
yeah, so we focus, there are some technologies that go out and look at what they call unstructured data. We're focusing mostly on the structured side here. So in other words, what that means is applications and databases. And that's generally where, not to say that unstructured data isn't a place where there's a lot of information, but there's really, on the structured side, there's a lot of what we call creep, sensitive data creep, that happens because of how systems evolve over time. Some of these systems have been in place for 10, 20 years, and I was talking earlier about an airline reservation system. We know those have been in place since the 60s and 70s, and you can only imagine, what is actually under the covers because these have been kind of patched and built over time. I know I'm kind of talking a little too much here. The last point on this slide is actually key when you're talking about how do you bring the technical audience and the business side, non-technical audience together, and it's really coming up with this common classification. Sometimes in the industry it's called a business glossary, where you have a common definition of what things are. What is it that I'm looking about? Is it customer information, employee information? Is it credit card information? Is it personal health information? And not explaining things from a technical point of view, just from a definition point of view. And then from there, if you're technical, you can drill down. If you're not technical, you can also understand exactly what this is describing, where it is in different systems across the enterprise.
So Kevin, is it your role and you deal with the IT folks primarily and not the legal department?
Most of the time we have it is coming from the IT side because they're kind of saying, we need help, right? And I think they also say that they don't necessarily know how to talk outside. They have business analysts and application owners, so I think there's conversation to happen there, but maybe not from a legal and compliance point of view. It's a difficult conversation, and I think it's probably a little scary from both sides about how does that conversation start. And this is kind of like a way to get the conversation started.
Yeah, because as a general rule, I mean, like I say, I've got a master's in computer science, so I think I can easily say this, that anybody that's any good with a computer is incapable of having a meaningful relation with another human. It's been my experience. And most IT people readily agree with that. And so part of the problem is if you don't say the right things, you don't ask the right question, Kevin, I think that you're not going to get the answers you're looking for. And I think, isn't that part of the difficulty?
Yeah, and hopefully this first step, kind of going to the next slide, is so once you kind of take the first step, how do you engage? And this is, if you notice here, this is, generally, besides application owners, this is a non-technical audience, right? So how do you take something that's being defined maybe outside the IT organization and use that common terminology when you're going through what we call the discovery process? That's what I was just talking about. and in surfacing that information and kind of working through this. In the center you can see data privacy. Basically, continually working around, because you're going to have to continue to measure and monitor, and then maybe redefine your policies and procedures, and it's something that keeps going.
Yeah, I was gonna, just before you move on more to the preventative side, Kevin, in that discovery of data, I was just going to ask you if you ever come back and talk to the owners of that data and have a discussion about, why are you keeping this data? I mean, Rebecca hinted at that earlier, but I think that's one of the things that we are, as an insurance person, and I'm a little bit on the outside, when we're talking about folks about purchasing insurance for the loss of their data, sometimes I ask them, well, why do you have this data? And I think that's a question that doesn't get asked enough. Sometimes people are keeping data and they say, we think it'll be valuable in the future. We don't have a business reason today. Or maybe there's an alternative way to do what they want to do without holding on to sensitive data. I was just wondering how much that comes up as you go through the discovery process.
Yeah, that's actually the key question. Why is this data there? And there's usually two things that any company can look at. So one is, if somebody built something that's maybe not even used anymore, an add-on to an application that is, you talk to the business users and you go, well, we don't even use it anymore. And there's these reports that get generated, and okay, so why wasn't that, taken out of service? And why wasn't the data actually retired, taken out of service too? And the other thing that happens with structured data inside databases is it's exactly the opposite of what happens with records that's in either paper or unstructured documents. You end up keeping the data forever, right? So that's usually not a record manager's problem. They're usually worried about like what a user did to destroy something that they shouldn't have. You have the exact opposite problem in the database. You're going to end up with these databases that just grow and grow and grow. And even if they got replaced, you still have an old system just sitting there, right? That someone forgets about and maybe is online and people have access to. Well, why not get rid of that? That's what we call application retirement. So I think the same rules about records management needs to be applied to data inside databases. And I think that's one of the things that's people are starting to understand. These are still records. They're just structured, no pun intended, a little differently, but they're still records, and they need to be managed.
But part of the issue, I think, is that from an IT perspective, the IT folks want to make sure that the data is always available, and it's sometimes very difficult for them to ferret out when they should get rid of data. So it may be not such an easy thing to do, and I think that's part of the complication, isn't it?
Well, so one of the jokes that we always talk about is that, so if you want to really see how much people need data, you actually just kind of don't tell them to take it away from them, and then wait for the phone to ring. And so you start carving off some pretty old data, and you're not getting rid of it. You're just taking it, taking to a next stage in its life cycle, and you'd be really surprised how much users are really in love with their data, because if you tell them you can't run a report that looks back 10 years, well, how often do they actually do that? So it doesn't mean they can't do it. It just means that they can't do it ad hoc. Well, that's not something, it's not normal day-to-day business activity. It might be something you do once a year or once every 3 years. So that can still be accommodated even though data is being moved out of systems. And that's, it should be a common business practice.
Well, I think that kind of goes back to, what's the business value of information, and talking to employees and getting past sort of that emotional, this is my information and I want to keep it around forever, because, information can also be a liability to organizations, and truly understanding the business needs, and then also any overlapping regulatory requirements can provide the insight for legal, IT, and the business to make a decision on how long you want to keep records or information. And that goes for legacy systems that are probably sitting around with information in them as well.
So you have complications like companies that are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. They have to keep the records for 50 years. And that might have been fine when everything was paper, but in today's world, how would you how would anybody in the room figure out how to read a 14-inch floppy disk? I mean, it's kind of hard to find a box to begin with, let alone software to even do that, and if that's how you stored it, it's very complicated. So if you have old data and it's on a different media, you may never be able to access it. That's a different problem altogether, I think. But I think the records retention issues are something probably that you could address that's very important with this.
Well, it's sort of, one of the surest ways to avoid a breach is to not have information in the first place. And so we're kind of talking about, real true records that, old traditional paper records that are sitting in a warehouse. If you've held on to everything, probably some sensitive information sitting in there as well. And also a liability when you have a litigation or a discovery event that can be expensive. You have to go through that. It goes with old emails that are sitting around and information sitting on file shares. So, where we come at this in the data privacy world and security world is only keep what you need to keep and get rid of what you don't need. But to do that, you first have to know what you have and where it is, and do sort of a data mapping exercise to be able to formulate decisions around how long do we really need to keep this? Do we have to keep this for a regulatory requirement? And I think those are some of the same questions when you're looking at cyber insurance that you're probably going to be asked is what are your records retention practices? How long are you keeping this information? Do you really need it? Is there a value to the business?
And so if maybe you want to talk about some of the protections and saving this data.
Aaron, did you want to say something on that?
Well,
on the last topic?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that not only how long you're keeping the data and just why, and is there a different way to get to the business objective? And as an insurer talking to a lot of retailers these days, for reasons I'm sure you all see in the news, one of the questions I'm asking people are, why are you keeping cardholder data? And sometimes they receive the answer that, well, that helps us identify customers. And it makes me think, isn't there a better way to identify customers? And there's both technologies these days which can take cardholder data and turn it into unique IDs, which don't have any value to criminals, which is one way to get around the problem. And I think Kevin's going to talk about tokenization. And then there's just a straight up analysis of, is this really worth the liability? Is losing this data and the potential liabilities I have for losing this data, does that outweigh the business gain I keep by knowing who my customer is and being able to sell to them a little bit better? In some cases, it may. In fact, I know of a few retailers who said, you know what, we made more knowing who our customers are and being able to sell our higher margin products to those folks than we lost in data breaches. But at least having that, doing that impact analysis. I just wanted to throw that out there as one topic, and I know that you were going to talk about some of the protections that are available in those technology protections.
Yeah, I kind of touched on them real quick already, but Peter, if you can go back one slide, I want to just talk about two different areas to look at. So one area under data security that we always look at is called data masking. So data masking is basically if somebody shouldn't be, if someone has access but they shouldn't be looking at some of the fields, can you actually change the values so that they're not actually seeing the sensitive information? So they're seeing maybe the base record, they're seeing some of the information, but when the field is being displayed, some of the sensitive information is being displayed, they're not seeing it, right? It's being X'd out or it's being changed to a different value. So there's three areas. So we can do that in live production systems, because sometimes the security is not good enough in the application. Another big hole, this is probably the biggest one, is in test systems. So it's common business practice that full-size copies of production systems are being used to do tests. And so if you make a copy, sometimes people call it a clone of a production system, basically means that, let's say it was your HR system. So people are actually running test reports against your information, real information, potentially your salary and other things. And so that's just a big no-no, right? So you can de-identify the data so it still feels. The reason why IT does that is because creating data is so difficult. And so what they want to do is they want to have the system still operate like it's a production system. But they don't really, it doesn't need to be the real data. And obviously there's a big breach potential if you are using production data when you're having lots of developers. Developers share passwords. They have direct access at the database level. A lot of times they're using third party or outsourcers. So that's a huge place.
Yeah, and I think it's important for the audience to understand, maybe you could talk about this a little bit as well, and that is when new systems are being developed, as you're pointing out, there is a test environment that's not live, not available to the business, and that's the kind of situation you're describing there, where they totally replicate all the data so that the tests are valid. I mean, I assume that's what the IT folks are thinking.
Yeah. So they either have to take data from another system that exists, because it's usually replacing an existing system, and no one's really thinking about, oh, well, I have to be really careful about what I'm actually pulling into this test system. That's the last thing a developer thinks about, because they're writing programs to get a job done. They're not thinking about, well, should I really pull that field or not pull that field? Somebody needs to govern that. And masking, if you define where the data is, and if you define masking rules, so you can basically make sure that when they're pulling data that they're going to get masked data, right? That there's a way to do that.
And I think from Garen's perspective, from insurance, that isn't something that most people would bother even understanding they need to insure if they have the development systems with multiple copies of the databases, right?
Yeah, we don't often get to that level of discussion, but we are definitely talking to people about the policies. Because when Kim was talking about, when you are creating new applications, are you following OWASP? Are you only using, which is practices for securely coding? And I think Kevin highlighted, the developers they're making tools. They want to make them work. They're not as focused on security. So that's one of the things that we, as an insurance person, are often asking. Who is responsible for information security? And there's often times when folks say, well, that's this person and Joe in IT. And I think that Joe in IT has a lot of responsibility on making sure the network runs, not necessarily that it's always secure. And if those two competing responsibilities can sometimes be to a company's detriment. So one of the things that we like to see is that folks who are dedicated to information security or information governance, and then the folks who are dedicated to availability and information technology, making it available. But definitely, when folks tell us that they have secure coding, secure development life cycles, software development life cycles in a secure manner, that is very advantageous.
Yeah, that actually, one more thing on that actually brings up, so a lot of times people say, yeah, we built that ourselves. And then you always ask the question, so where's your documentation? And if somebody, a compliance officer came to you or an auditor came to you, how do you prove that you do what you say you're doing? I think you are doing it, but how do you prove it? So the audit trails, documentation, how do you ensure that every time that you are building these systems, whether it's test dev or that you're doing it, and usually that's when they go, yeah, we know we need something that is a little more robust than what we built ourselves.
And so how do you go about validating that? Or what mechanisms? That's something that you probably do as well, isn't it, Rebecca?
Well, one of the things I was going to say is, what we find, because remember, we're on the business side of this. We're not necessarily touching applications, but what we uncover are, people with appropriate credentials to information that are extracting information out of applications, and they're dropping it to the thumb drive. You all heard about, Coca-Cola lost a laptop with 75,000 current and past employees on it. Well, that was an employee with appropriate credentials that downloaded that information. So that's an example. One of the other things that we see are sort of under-the-table applications, because we ask business people, what are the applications that you're using to support your records and information? So we found applications that IT thought had been retired, but were still being used. We find oftentimes, some third-party cloud applications that are being used. So you kind of begin to see not just the applications IT knew about, but also, some other applications that are being used as well that do contain sensitive information.
I like the term shadow IT for the use of cloud. I think it's easy for people to say, we don't use the cloud, and then it says, well, actually, some of the folks who do, our sales and marketing team actually uses the cloud as one instance to host, our new application, because everyone has an application. And just controlling that process sometimes is very hard, to know all the systems, and that's where, your software, I was very impressed. I wish more of my insurers were able to map where all their data is as easily as
So do
seem to
we.
be able to.
So I think another point that everybody needs to be aware of, because I think you brought up a good point there, Kevin, about the cloud. The cloud concept is not really very new. I mean, the name is new, but actually it's been around since 1964. It used to be called Dartmouth Time Sharing. And the only difference between 1964 and 2014 is instead of using telephone lines to deliver the data and get it back, we use the internet. So technically, there's really nothing too new about it. It does have a good buzz and is a real popular term right now, but I think from an IT standpoint, it's very old news, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think it's more, it's just more commonplace now, and there's so many more folks using cloud, and like Aaron was saying, that it's kind of almost outside of IT sometimes, because it's being driven by the business, of how they uptake it. So it's not IT driven, it's more business driven now.
Well, and it didn't seem to keep the CIOs up at night either very much, based on the phone and the table you had before.
Yeah, well, now it's, yeah, so I think some of that's out of sight, out of mind, but what we're finding with cloud is that you've got the same set of concerns around, what's happening to those systems. Same test development environments. It's just being done by someone else. It's just not being done by your IT organization. So, that should open up some other concerns.
If you don't mind, I just want to say the cloud keeps the insurers up at night.
That's good to know.
We need that slide.
Just because of data aggregation issues. It's when we think about a couple big cloud providers who have a lot of data, and it's almost like writing the whole state of Florida for hurricane risk. It makes us a little touchy. The other thing that I think is worth asking about cloud is that I do believe cloud is sort of a new bug and an old technology, but I think the thing that's been really amazing lately is how people are using it, and people are building cloud applications on top of cloud platforms, on top of cloud infrastructure.
Right.
And you tend not to realize the dependencies that are there, that you oftentimes are maybe doing business with someone who's building you a software application in the cloud, and you don't really realize that they are using another cloud provider who's using another cloud provider. And that's one of the things, one of the other questions that we as insurers are asking: what are your business dependencies, and how are you dealing with those? I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, and I think another issue that's important in the middle of this, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, and that is with the cloud, one of the big cloud providers most of y'all know are Amazon and Microsoft and Google and all the big internet companies. But they balance their data in different sites, and so it's all over the world. At any given time, you don't necessarily know where it is. And that raises some really complex privacy law problems where data is being stored in another country. You might not know that, and so I think that's an important feature. And I think from an insurance standpoint, that's a huge risk when it's being stored in a country where maybe they don't pay attention to U.S. laws, like China, for instance. Nothing wrong with China; it's a beautiful place, but I think that's an issue.
I think it's an issue, issue for all companies, including cloud companies. European data laws, and there's two ways that a lot of companies are multinational and have customers in Europe, but have host data here, and how to attack that problem, making sure you can import the data back and utilize it here in your home, in your home country, be it a model contract or safe harbor. I think it's particularly important for cloud, but it's also important for any company, and that's some of the stuff that, again, when we ask where your data is, and do you know what the different, not only do you know where your data is, but I guess there's another layer to that question is, do you know what the rules around that data are? Can you take customer records out of France and bring them to marketing here in the U.S. to work with or to do something with. That's a great point.
And one of the issues that's come up because in the wake of Edward Snowden is a concept called data localization, which Germany is considering right now. A few countries are as well, and that is where the countries will regulate that all data about citizens and businesses in that country have to reside on a computer in that country. The issue you just raised is a huge problem when countries start enacting laws like that, I think.
I think some of the bigger, more sophisticated cloud providers are sensitive to it, and that they will have data centers only in specific regions, and they will pledge to you that we won't move data from that region unless you tell us. But I certainly agree, and that's one of the questions we as insurers are asking, and that definitely entities need to be asking themselves is, are we making sure that not only do we know where our data is, but are we complying with all the regulations? Because there's an earlier slide up on all the regulations we have here in the U.S. Around where data is, and there's no one unifying data law, and certainly when you add in all other countries, it gets very, very complicated.
Well, and what about this landscape for rate of change? I think that's an important message here on this slide.
Yeah, this is really trying to depict that, depending on how long the company's been around, you're probably dealing with, you go left to right, going back to the mainframe days. There's companies that are still running on mainframes today that you probably have just about every single one of these technologies. If you're an older company, if you're newer, you might be lucky, but you might only have like the two to the right. But the whole point here is that things keep changing, and you have data underneath all these systems that you need to manage and that you need to plan for as you move along. And I mentioned part of that was, as you decommission these older systems, have a strategy for getting rid of those. And one of the things we're finding is that if you decommission and move things, so the data won't go away per se, but you can actually consolidate the data. And now the whole thing we talked about, how often are people accessing data, what is it used for? Now you can actually have an audit trail because the data is consolidated, it's in a single place. And you can start to leave off the systems that you're leaving behind and really kind of focus on the stuff to the right, which is what I think everybody wants. IT wants that because their costs will go down, and I think legal and compliance and the risk folks want that too because the risk goes down with that as well.
And then it does a lot to help lower the cost as well, right? Theoretically.
No, big time. So whether you're in healthcare or financial services, you're leaving so many of these systems behind that just one e-discovery project where you have to resurrect the system and bring a whole team back, that you're bringing specialists in who are going to be charging through the nose just to be able to make sense of that system, because you figured, I'm going to keep this for posterity, but now that one project's going to cost you quite a bit.
So just as a point of reference, one of the things I've been negotiating for a number of years to help with e-discovery is to get a license to keep the software for 7 years after the company stops using it. And most vendors, including IBM and Microsoft, are happy to do that because that way if you limit it, you're not using it, but you save it for e-discovery. I think that's a real pragmatic way to help protect yourself for the legacy data. And of course, then you'll forget 7 years later the return it, so you probably have it forever anyway. That could happen.
So this is a little bit of a promotional slide, but just if you look at the left-hand side of the initiatives that your company can take on, or maybe what you can go to the IT folks and talk about and not have it be this this difficult conversation. So data security, I talked about test data management. So this is where you're managing your development, your testing, your training processes, where that's where you have holes. And then also talking about what's your archive strategy, how are you actually getting rid of data, so you can kind of get on the other side of, well, we just keep these systems around forever. And if you look across the top, those are really the, kind of, we just talked about this a little bit, is reducing risk, improving the agility of your IT organization, but also, kind of out from there into the business side, and then driving your cost low.
But as a practical matter, I mean, back to the IT world, IT people really only care about one thing, and that's disasters, because they know they're going to have one. Inevitably, as a matter of fact, every single component of every computer has something called a mean time between failure, and so everything's going to fail. You all have thumb drives sitting in front of you. These are designed to use 256 times, not any more than that. So they're going to fail at some point around 256 times. And so you need to know that. So what happens is with IT, which is, I think, part of the point that Kevin was making before, is that IT cares about saving the data, but what they care about is disaster. So for instance, a few years back, at our Houston office on the 33rd floor of Wells Fargo Plaza, we had a flood in our data center, and it was completely wiped out. You don't expect that at the 33rd floor, but we didn't lose anything because the way we replicate our data. And I think that's a very important idea, that the IT people care about that, and that's something that's very important to them. And then another huge issue that we've got to be confronted with, particularly from the lawyer side, is the laws around these devices, our cell phones and our tablets and home computers, that we expect our employees to be using. The Supreme Court a few years back, 5 years ago, ruled that an employee is not entitled to any privacy if they're using a company-issued device. But if they're using their own device, it starts to get a lot fuzzier. If they're doing work for their employer, that's information belongs to the employer. But how do you get that data? And this is a real complicated issue, and I think from a security standpoint, this is another area where you really can't protect that very well because you don't know what's out there. So from the standpoint of insurance, maybe you could give us a better idea about some of the issues that are important in the cyber insurance policies.
Sure. So the first thing I wanted to, and I hinted at this earlier, and I wanted to put this up at a slide because I think it bears emphasizing, is that oftentimes we talk about cyber insurance, we talk about cyber attacks, and the emphasis is on the cyber. I think cybersecurity is a subset of information security risks, and that's someone breaking in and stealing information. There's also accidental disclosure. I think MBIA, the bond insurer, was in the news a couple weeks ago for, unfortunately, it wasn't a hack. They just misconfigured a web server, and they were putting up a bunch of information that shouldn't have been out there. So accidental disclosure is a potential information security exposure. I also think there's the whole privacy side. And sometimes on the privacy side, it can be not necessarily losing information, but collecting it in the first place. There's a lot of companies out there who found out the hard way that there are state laws regarding what kind of information you can collect with regards to a credit card transaction. It's on Beverly. Sometimes you have the information and you lawfully collected the information, but then you used it in the wrong way. You broke your own privacy policy. So we use the term cyber insurance, but most cyber policies today in the insurance marketplace are really information security and privacy policies. And they respond to privacy events and security failures. So when you lose information in a security in an electronic manner because someone breaks in, or you disclose it accidentally, and it also responds to non-electronic privacy events. It'll respond to, and this happened in one of the slides I showed earlier. A hospital left hundreds of medical records in boxes at a doctor's driveway as they were trying to coordinate moving medical records from his office to a physician's group. So it does happen. So I just wanted to make that point that these policies cover more than that. Oftentimes, cyber insurance policies today, most of the carriers are offering them with not only solely the risk transfer aspect, just paying your premium, getting the risk off your books. They also offer a lot of loss prevention services on the front end and breach resolution services on the back end. If you're familiar with the property insurance model, sometimes your property insurer will have their loss control engineers come out and tell you that it's not a great idea. You should widen move the gas-soaked rags away from the boiler. Nowadays, insurance companies are starting to help and provide some value-added services. Not, disclaimer plug coming. AIG does provide a lot of loss prevention services to harden our insurers. We've partnered with some pretty cool vendors out there who are providing a lot of threat intelligence. They actually sit outside your network, between your network and the internet, and turn away all the folks who shouldn't be talking to you. They maintain a subscription list of bad actors out there. They refresh it every 6 minutes, and they just stop those folks from even getting in touch with you. You always have the option to let them in if you want. If you want to talk to Nigerian princes, that's fine. But we partnered with some folks who provide you that kind of service. So. And then on the breach resolution side, I think that insurance policy, there are a lot of moving parts, and these guys can talk about it, to the 48, the 46, I think, so 46 or 47 different electronic breach notification laws in the states. I think 46. And Graham Leach Bliley, and you got COPPA, Children's Online Privacy Act, and FERPA, and the list goes on. All the different, so just how to deal with all those regulations, how to get the expertise. You talked about the forensic investigator to come tell you what data was actually lost. Can be very expensive. On the breach resolution side, a lot of carriers are helping you by guiding you through that process and making recommendations as to what needs to be done and how to do it in a fiscally appropriate manner. I mean, we've unfortunately, sad to say, seen some insureds who've had an issue and turned to some vendors to help them deal with that, do so in a way in which they frankly overspent. So those are two things to ask about when you talk to your insurance carrier. Not only what does the contract cover, and it should cover most of these things, but also, is there anything you can do to make me a better risk? And God forbid I have a risk or have an incident. How would I work with you, and who would you recommend to minimize the harm?
And having negotiated a number of cyber insurance policies, what I have found is that it's really important that the lawyers who are participating understand the underlying IT issues. And I think that's kind of the point that Kevin was making earlier about what have you got, what is out there, and I think how you go about managing it is really critical. But it's incumbent upon the lawyers to really understand this. You can't, I think as from the lawyer's perspective, we have to be in a position where we can give sound advice, and it's not just, well, we'll accept that policy, because we have to know what could go wrong and then what are the consequences. I know that I represent a number of healthcare providers, and so in addition to HIPAA, if somebody else has access, which is very common today with the electronic health record, what exposure do you have and what liability do you have if that PHI is exposed? And you can only insure so much, no matter what. Then you have to make a decision in advance. How expensive is it going to be for you if you have a breach?
Yeah, and I just wanted to weigh in there. Kevin had some of the funding one figures up there, which are, I don't disagree with them. There are very high costs to a breach, and there's some, you can plug in how many records you lost and what type of records, and you can get some stats. Even though I think that the actuarial history behind cyber breaches is we don't understand it as well as we understand, like car accidents or life insurance, but we're beginning to get a lot of data points on it. The one thing I would say about Ponymon is that it does include a lot of uninsurable costs. AIG has a free calculator. Again, I hate to plug. There's some other carriers out there. I can't name one off the top of my head. Say that honestly. Provide a free calculator where you can put in the number of records and it will show you an insurable cost breakdown. How much you can expect to get for, how much you can expect the forensic investigation to cost, a data breach coach, a law firm to help you navigate those 46 different electronic breach notification laws. The cost of actually mailing out and doing the notification in compliance with those laws. And then, typically today, obviously, they offer some identity monitoring as a way to mitigate the harm. And then, of course, we get into the third-party side of dealing with the liability losses. But they can give you some stats around the insurable costs and what those look like.
So we just have a few minutes left. I wonder if anybody are there any questions from the audience that y'all might have towards any of us on the panel? Yes.
I want to take a step back to the contracting part of this. If you're a company contracting with a vendor that's going to provide these services to you, what's the standard in the trade right now that you can expect that a vendor will provide you in the way of warranties and so on? Because I know that we're a lot better than we were even 5 years ago, where it was like, take it or leave it, and, as is, and no warranties and so on. But where are we standing now? And what kinds of provisions do you recommend, in addition to the one that you already mentioned about, give me this data, so that after, in a form, so that after my contract is done, I can still get it.
I think that was 7 questions, actually. My sense in negotiating technology agreements it really varies widely between who the vendor is. Like, for instance, in Oracle's agreement, there are about 5 things they'll negotiate. IBM actually negotiates more than most other vendors. I think that varies widely, but I wouldn't say that there's a uniform way to do it. I think everybody's probably familiar with, enterprise resource program, ERPs. The failure rate on those is something like 65%. So when you negotiate those kinds of contracts, you look for different things because the failure rate's so high. It really depends on the industry as well. So I would generally say that there's no simple answer to what you're going to be looking for in contracts. But my experience has always been, if you put out a request for proposal and the vendor gives a proposal, they should be willing to put anything that's in writing in the proposal in the contract, because they're promising to say that. A lot of vendors are unwilling to do that.
Peter, if you don't mind, I just wanted to weigh in on that question
Sure.
from again, an insurer standpoint. We talked about some of the trends in bring your own device and cloud, and cloud is one of the ones that we're grappling with, and we see a lot of cloud providers with some pretty low, liability caps on their contracts, and it is tough. It's very cost effective to use, say, infrastructure as a service from someone like an AWS or
Which is Amazon.
Amazon Web Services, or Microsoft's Azure. They don't, they're providing you a service. They don't understand the value that you're getting from the service. I mean, you might be using it to run a very high margin business, and you might, making 30 cents on every dollar. And they're only going to warrant it. Typically, what I see, they're only going to provide you some kind of service level agreement that is reasonable, and they'll agree to return the fees if the service fails. But that doesn't really help you if you're making that much money on it. I think it's really incumbent upon the consumer of those services to really understand from the provider, what can I expect, and what does your business continuity look like, and how can I work with you to create a better plan? As a practical example, one big cloud provider, Azure had the leap day bug, and they were down for 24 hours. 24 hours in 365 days seems like a pretty decent uptime. But there were some folks who didn't have any backup plan. And I think that for the cost they were paying to use those services, that was a good result. But they didn't have the backup plan. They didn't ask the question. And as an insurer, that's one of the things we're asking. Just because someone says they're up 99.9% of the time, what's your backup plan? And have you had a frank discussion with them about, in the unlikely event, knock on wood, something happens, what your plan B is?
Right, I think that is important. And I think with service levels and all those kinds of things that are included in cloud, you have to make some judgment calls about whether or not you're getting some good deal or not. And then some cloud providers, to pay premium, they'll have a disaster recovery and backup so that they wouldn't be down like what happened with Microsoft there. The other thing is with Amazon, the Department of Homeland Security last year concluded that they have more malware on their cloud than any other cloud provider in the world, and they're the largest cloud provider. So you have that problem too, is if you select the wrong vendor and there's malware there, then you've got other problems. Yes?
So my question surrounds, how do you get a handle on employees' access to data? Because even if you assume it's not a BYOD situation, you've got employees who have company-owned devices, they have access to, Outlook and things through webmail on their own home computers. So say they're checking their email and they've got a spreadsheet full of PII of customers or whatever it might be, and there's a copy of that now on their home computer. I mean, what are your recommendations about how to, you were talking about know where your data is, but you don't necessarily know, say you have 10,000 employees, you don't know how many people are accessing it and when they're accessing it and what is actually still out there.
Yeah, and the answer to that is it's a nightmare.
Okay.
So I don't think there's no simple answer, and it really varies widely by industry. There are some companies that prohibit employees from using thumb drives on their devices or using webmail at work. And there are all
But it
kinds of
still
things, but so they
happens.
do it on their tablets. So
Right,
it's
or
a-
they take, they take their company device and back it up to their cloud, their home cloud.
Right.
And all sorts of things like that. And so you can have all the policies you want, but the employees are still doing it.
It's very difficult to monitor, and the BYOD is just a huge nightmare.
But that's what everybody's doing.
Yeah, I
And so,
agree, and the
you
trend
know.
is even more than that
Exactly.
one, and it's growing.
I really want to weigh in on this one because it's very interesting. The point I wanted to make is that if IT says you cannot do this, you shouldn't, I'm going to prevent you from plugging in a USB because I think that if you guys move sensitive information to a USB, it's going to get lost and we're going to have issues. The minute you do that, they're going to email it to their
Exactly.
home account.
Right.
Yep.
So they're going to take the path of least resistance. So I think one of the things that, and then I am not an information security professional, I'm an underwriter of information security. But we've seen success, and I'll just share, we've seen clients who have moved to virtual desktops, which I think is a great solution. So instead of giving your employee a laptop, you give them access to a virtual desktop. So from home, they start up their own computer and they utilize their virtualized machine in the office. Therefore, the data never actually leaves the office. It just comes to the machine and is displayed on the screen. There's a little bit of technology there that maybe someone more apt than I can talk about, but for all intents and purposes, that list of sensitive PII they're working with never actually gets saved on their computer.
Unless they're dishonest and they're thieves,
Right.
and which, it's kind of hard to control that demand. Well, I think we've run out of time. I really appreciate it. I wanted to tell you all a couple of things. If you have not made sure your parking was validated, you can do that on the way out. And believe it or not, we kind of redid this PowerPoint this morning. So we'll provide copies to you after today, since you have no idea, we had 40 slides, we went down to 20, so it was a big change. Thank you very much for joining us. I thank the panel for participating today very much.
I was just going to point out that on the thumb drives is some really terrific information. I've been carrying this around for like the last 6 or 7 weeks when I've been doing these CLE presentations, but I think AIG put this together in association with the National Association of Corporate Directors because this is now a board level issue. And one of the things I was just going to point out is, the employees in training, that's one of the gaps. This is not just an IT issue, it's a business, it's a legal, and an IT issue. So some great resources on the thumb drives for you.
Thank you very much for joining us today.